Yeah. I'd have to go grab the notebook.
Okay.
She says that stories set the inner life into motion. And Carl Jung has my second favorite quote, which is, transformation only happens in the presence of story, myth, and image, not with rational arguments. And we know this because we can't argue someone into believing something. It's probably half our problem lately. We cannot argue someone into believing the same thing we believe or feeling the same thing we feel. That comes through story and myth. That comes through the power of feeling something, not knowing something. So I find it fascinating because I was a Latin geek in high school. They have 2 words for word. We have 1 word for words. 2 words are logos and mythos. One meaning logic, and one obviously meaning myth or story. And so words can be used for both. And in the opening of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis dedicates the book to his goddaughter, and her name is Lucy. And he says, someday you will be old enough to read fairy tales again. What does he mean? Doesn't he mean like someday you'll be young enough to read fairy tales again? Why old enough to read fairy tales again? And it's because, are we old enough to read fairy tales again yet? We go through this phase where we think only logic matters until we remember how important stories are. So I did a lot of research on fairy tales for this book, and I thought it really fascinating that they have been called so many things through the years. They've been called fairy stories, wonder tales, dream tales, and by Oscar Wilde, beautiful, untrue things. Don't you love that? Beautiful, untrue things. I almost titled the book, Beautiful, Untrue Things. Either way, fairy tales are meaning making. So what were your favorite fairy tales growing up? Or even your fairy folk tales or tales? Was it Winnie the Pooh? Did you identify with Cinderella? Did you think Eeyore was your spirit animal, like my dad? Or was it the Little Mermaid who taught you to find your voice? We all, I bet, if we went around the room, every single person here could name their favorite childhood tale that sticks with you and doesn't leave. And all of them offer some kind of story and lesson in them. And here's I'm not going to tell you the whole fairy tale because it's a long Celtic fairy tale. I'll mess it up. But okay, here's a great one. There is an Irish farmer. His name is Sean. I don't know if that's really his name in the actual folk tale, but we're going to call him Sean. And he finds his family is hungry. He lives with his mom and his dad and his wife. And his wife is pregnant and they need food. So he goes out hunting. And he has a bow and arrow and he runs across the mythical white stag. And it is said that if you kill a white stag, you can have anything you want. He pulls back his bow and arrow, and the white stag speaks. He says, stop. if you don't kill me, I will grant one wish, whatever you want. And he says, I don't know what that is yet. And he's thinking about his mom and his dad and his pregnant wife. And the stag says, go home, sleep on it, and come back tomorrow and tell me. So he goes home and he tells his mom and his dad and his pregnant wife about the white stag and how he didn't bring home the food because they can have a wish. And the mother says, well, I am blind. I want you to wish that I can see again. And the father says, well, I am poor. We are poor, and I want you to wish for money. And the wife says, I want you to wish that we have a healthy child. He can't sleep all night. He tosses and turns. Whose wish is he going to grant? He goes out the next morning, finds the white stag waiting for him, and he says, I don't want to mess this up. He says, I wish that my mother could gaze upon my brand new healthy child in a crib made of gold. So these are the tales that teach us lessons, which are, how do we say what we want? How can we, and for Narnia and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, what we learn, among many other things, is that we might be ordinary people, but we are divine creatures in another world. That we are kings and queens in another world. That we aren't exactly what you see, that there is more than what you see in your life. And I love that. I recently wrote an essay. I promise I will not read the whole thing. I recently wrote an essay about fairy tales, and I wrote this. If we want to argue that fairy tales are too fanciful, can we be reminded that the best of these tales don't deny darkness or sorrow or loss, but they do offer what Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings and one of C.S. Lewis's closest friends, calls the consolation of a happy ending. In other words, in a fairy tale, we get both the light and the dark, the magical and the real, the good and the bad. We get the fairy godmother and the evil stepmother. We get the wolf in grandma's clothing and a wish-granting stag. We get the terrifying woodlands and we get the happy end. So there are certain myths and certain stories that stick with us and endure in the world and become part of our universal consciousness. And I know that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is one of those. Because even if you've never read it, and maybe some of you here haven't, you don't have to read my book, I promise. I know my husband's never read it, right? You've never read it. Yeah, you see? So even if you've never read it, you still know who Aslan is, right? You still know who the White Witch is. You still know who Tumnus and the Faun are, because that book has entered our universal consciousness. We all know who they are, even if we've never read the book. So I am endlessly fascinated about the origins of stories. I know some of you here watch Friends in Fiction, and and I have my Friends in Fiction people here. And we ask almost every single author, as y'all know, about their origin story. Where did this story come from? What inspired this story? What was the first spark of this book that made you want to write this novel? And every culture in the world has an origin story. The Celtics believe there were a god and a goddess named Danu and Dan. The Hindus have their origin. Every culture in the world has an origin story. And I started to get curious about the origin story of this world, of Narnia. And I wanted to know myself, just what George wanted to know, which is, where did it come from? So I leave the final answer to the experts in psychology and philosophy and religion. But when I want an answer, I turn to story. So this is part of how I became curious, and I ran across this line. There were once 4 children named Anne, Martin, Rose, and Peter. Isn't right? It's the wrong names. Anyone who's read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe knows the opening line is, there were once 4 children named Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. So Lewis wrote down that first line, put it away, and came back to it 10 years later. Isn't that amazing? Peter's the only one who survived. I don't know what happened to Anne Martin Rose, but Peter made it from the end, Anne Martin Rose, and Peter to the front. Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, and he dropped Anne Martin and Rose. But we tend to think when we read a book that it came fully formed because we read it already finished and forget that there's this long process because Lewis started this book, put it away, came back to it with new names, but exactly the same inspiration. So I tend to believe, especially with someone like this, that he knew what he was doing all along, that a man as genius as he was sat down and the whole story just showed up. But that's not true. In fact, and we'll get to some of my favorite facts about Narnia in a bit, surprising facts. And one of them is that in the first draft, there was not even a line. So as we look at how these stories are made, I started to ask, what is conscious in a story and what is unconscious from the author and from myself? Because when I was writing Becoming Mrs. Lewis, I could see all these little breadcrumbs of Lewis's life that I could also see in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, I'm not an expert even by a shred of evidence for the entire 7 Chronicles of Narnia, but I have read the first one as many times as possible, and I can see these little things of his life that were inside this magical land. And I wondered how much was conscious, how much was unconscious, how much did he do on purpose, and how much just showed up in this land. And he has another great quote, which is, sometimes fairy stories may say best what needs to be said. And when I reread that recently, before I wrote this book, I thought, well, the best way to answer this question of these fascinating breadcrumbs in his life that showed up in this story is with another story. There are enough books out there that give theories about why Lewis wrote this book and what he meant. And I don't want to know what they are, what other people think he meant. That just the same as when I was writing Mrs. Lewis. I don't want to know what people think she thought. I want her to tell me through her letters and her poetry and her essays. And same with this. I wanted to show it in a story instead of me saying this equals this or this equals this. Because all these pieces of our life might show up in a story, but there are huge swaths of story source that are completely ineffable, completely inexplainable. When somebody asks us, where did that idea come from? We're like, we make up some stuff, but the answer is we don't know, right? Ideas, just had dinner with my amazing editor in from Nashville and her darling daughter, Kaylee. And I said, when George visited me, and she said, what? I said, my imagination. George is the little boy in the story. But that's how it feels. You know, George visits you and the story starts. So when I first sat down to write the novel, I believed my novel was only about the enduring quality of these fairy tales, not just Narnia, but any fairy tale. But it ended up being about so much more. It ended up being about the ineffable quality of what I call the half-mapped land of imagination, because we can't peg it down. So I imagined this young boy, George, the year the book came out. And when we picked the pub date, we had no idea it was the 71st anniversary of this book. So it's a little nod right there. But then Megs came to visit me, and she started, his sister, and she was going to be the source of the answer to him. And yet I knew that I didn't want Lewis to lecture us. I didn't want her to ask Lewis the question, him answer her, and us have to listen to him tell something. So it took me a while to figure out how to do it. Amanda and I talked about it a few times. And I finally decided that the best way to do it was that Lewis would tell her, she would write it in a notebook. she would read it to George, and we as the reader and me as the writer would see it through 8-year-old George's innocent, naive eyes. That we would see things about the author's life through a young boy's innocence. And to me, George lives in this very liminal in-between space. And so, although, oh, and of course there's a love story, because I will never write a book. So we do meet a wonderful boy named Patrick. So I'm gonna give you a little secret about this book. I don't even know if my family's figured it out yet. So there are 3 main characters aside from C.S. Lewis and his wonderful, charming brother, Warnie. There is George, who is the 8-year-old boy, and my youngest son's first name is George. The charming literature student that Megs meets is named Padraig, which is Irish for Patrick. And my son's name is Patrick, and my husband's name is Patrick. And the girl in the story is named Megs, and my daughter is Megan. So I snuck more of my family in this book than I should. But for me, writing this book didn't have as much to do with Narnia as it did this, not battle, but this logic versus imagination. Because in many ways, I am Megs, and Megs is the rational, logical one who wants to argue against imagination. And we are all Megs, and we are all George. So we have logic versus imagination in these 2 very different characters. And I wanted to have them have to influence each other because I don't want it to be an either or, I want it to be an and both. So how can we keep our logic, but add imagination, not plant our flags on one side or the other? And people like neat categories, I do too. All of my notebooks have little tabs and my lists have lists. And I put things on my list so I can cross them off so my list looks better. Put something on their to-do list so you have to cross it off. So I'm going to read one more thing from my essay and then I want us to just have a conversation. So as I walked through the wardrobe door to write Once Upon a Wardrobe, I realized once again that it is imagination that often delivers the truth. The enchanted realm is where some of our answers just might wait. Beyond princesses in castles and princes on white horses, beyond thorny roses and through castle gates, past a white witch and with a fawn. And as we lean into the words, once upon a time, we might find a truth we never saw in our to-do list of logical answers. I know if you've ever heard me talk before, you've heard me mention John O'Donohue. And he once wrote that a book is a path of words which take the heart in new directions. And that is what I hope to do with this book. And my editor and publisher said when she bought it, I've always believed that if we can find our way to Narnia, we can find our way home. So tell me what you all want to talk about. And I do have a list of really interesting secrets behind the stories of things that show up, but I want to hear your questions. Tell me what you all want to talk about. So tell me some questions you have. I know you do. All right. Then I'm going to just list these fun facts. I'm going to tell you a couple while you're thinking of your questions. When Lewis first started this book in 1939, and he wrote those other 4 children that didn't end up in the final book, he had World War II evacuees living with him at his house, all accounts. It was a period in World War II history called Operation Pied Piper. I bet you've never heard it called that. And I'm still baffled by the British calling it Operation Pied Piper, because does anyone know what the Pied Piper did? Yeah. Okay, my story people. He played the flute and led children out of the village to drown in the river in Germany. So why the British named this Operation Pied Piper, I'll never know. But this operation during World War II sent all these children out of the big cities to live in the countryside. And Lewis had children living with him. And that was part of the inspiration for this story, and probably where the name Rose and Margaret, even though he got rid of them, came from. The first draft, like I mentioned, had absolutely no mention of Aslan. And then he started having lion dreams. And Aslan is the Turkish word for lions. Another one. When Lewis was, and some of this you read about in the book, and some of this you don't. But when he was a child, he was fascinated with atlases, huge atlases that were in the house. And he would flip through them, and he ran across a little Italian town named Narni. And he liked the way it sounded. And it stuck in his brain all those years. So 30 years ago, when he sat down to write a story, he made up a land called Narnia. So we can find all these little breadcrumbs, and then they show up in a magical land, but it's not made out of nothing. It's made out of all these pieces of our life that work their way into something bigger. And I just find it incredibly fascinating that someone can take the ordinary and then turn it into the extraordinary. And I think that's probably why we love it so much. But to take these ordinary things in his life and turn them into something extraordinary. A simple name like Narni, a small town in Italy that he never visited and never went to, became an entirely magical land. So, okay, come on, tell me your question. I have more, but I want to hear your question. Yes, ma'am.
Would you please share that his mother took him to the castle?
Yes.
That was, I love that. I'm
Thank
so
you.
happy you shared that.
Thank you. So what she's talking about, I've been on Instagram, I've been giving the secrets behind my ideas for the story. And when Lewis was a young child, he was very close to his mother, who he lost when he was 9 years old. And she took him and his big brother, Warnie. She would take them on holiday to he grew up in Belfast. And she would take them to Northern Ireland. And there's a castle at the very tip of Ireland called Dunluce Castle. It's ruined now. It's a medieval castle, and it's nothing but ruins, stone ruins, and it sits on this cliff. You saw the picture. It looks like it came out of a magical fairy tale, but it's real, and it sits on this cliff overlooking the ocean. And there is a story that during one of the battles in medieval times, it was being rushed, and the cooks were in the kitchen preparing food, and the kitchen fell off into the sea because it sat on this cliff, and the whole kitchen fell off, and a young boy went running. It's a story, it's probably true. A young boy went running to get something and brought it back to the kitchen, and it was gone. The whole thing fell into the sea. And when you see this picture of this castle, you'll realize it. But Lewis, when he saw that as a young boy at 7 or 8 years old, for most of us, that would be, oh, that is beautiful. We might sort of remember it. He turned that into Cair Paravel. He turned that into the castle of White Witch. He turned that into something that almost everyone universally knows by taking this one little small piece. I'm glad you noticed that. Yes, ma'am.
So if you were to flip the switch and be Lewis, what do you want Lewis to think about your story?
Oh man, I've done like 10 podcasts and 5 interviews, and nobody's asked me that. Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. What would I want him to think of my story?
Yes, that's fabulous.
For anyone who's read it, thank you. I would want him to think I honored his part. I would want him to think that I honored, he has a great quote about imagination being the organ of meaning, which I think is one of my favorite things he says. Because we don't make meaning out of anything without using our imaginations, right? So I would hope that he would be grateful that I didn't try to ascribe allegorical meaning to everything in the book, but instead just told the truth of his life and then let you decide. And I think that's, I mean, for me, one of the best parts about it is you never have to have read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or even care about C.S. Lewis to read this book, because the book is about Megs and George and this adventure they go on, and loss and grief. And I wrote this during lockdown in the pandemic. And I would hope Lewis would be honored by how I honored his story, but also leaned into the importance and meaning making of imagination and story, because I think he did. He has this great quote about Norman's here, he would probably quote it better than I can, but about how Lewis always tried to write past our watchful dragons. And I really love that, because what he means is that he doesn't want to tell you anything. He wants to get past your watchful dragons of logic and defenses, and he doesn't want to tell you anything. He wants you to feel something, and whatever you come to on your own. And I would hope that he would say, and also I hope Joy would love it. I really care what she thinks more than But yeah, that's a great expression, but I wrote it during the pandemic, and I think that changed the book completely, because I was going to write this book no matter what. I had started working on it, and I had a book finished. Surviving Savannah was finished and in the chute and was ready to come out the following March. And I thought for sure the pandemic would be over, whatever. And so I had started this book and was going to go back to it after tour and all of that. And then the world locked down in March of 2020, and my son in graduate school came home, my son in college came home, and my husband came home from work. And we were all in one house, and we were all together, and we were all trying to work. And this book was my still point in a world burning around me. And every single day, I could come to this magical land of Worcester and Oxford and to this story. And so writing it during that time probably changed it a lot compared to what it would have been if I had been writing it during before times. We're like before and after now, aren't we? We're not even to after. But I think it would have been significantly different because I was able to really live with it every day. And it was my still point in a turning crazy world. I was able to dive a little deeper, and I hope he would like that. Yes, Ms. Lanier.
I have two questions. So, what's an example of your dreams affecting your work? If you're using a character, or
I love that.
do you have one? Or how do your dreams influence your work?
My dreams, I mean, just like you, they do. And Lanier and I talk about these things a lot. My dreams do influence my work, and they're usually not the crazy REM sleep dreams, like where you're learning how to fly in a museum. That was a weird one. And when I was writing Surviving Savannah, I had a lot of water dreams. I mean, as one would think I might. Like at one time I was in a room and the water was seeping under the door and filling up the room. So they have more to do with feelings than images, I think. But a lot of the dreams, especially for this book, came in that liminal space between dreaming and waking, that early morning or drifting off to sleep, which is where the town of Worcester came in. I saw that cottage, and it was a dream, but it was more this image in that liminal space. And I've just learned, we talk about this all the time, I've learned to trust that and not think that those dreams and sometimes it's just a feeling in a dream, like walking over the bridge in winter. And I'll know, and it'll shift things. Even what I'm working on now, I've had a couple dreams that haven't, like I don't dream scenes. I've never dreamt a scene, and I have friends who do, and I hate them. But they say that Mary Kay says she wakes up with this whole scene sequence. I'm like, whatever. But I will wake up with a very particular feeling of nostalgia or melancholy or love, and know that that has to get worked into the next day's scene. And because I usually write very, very first thing in the morning when I wake up, I try to stay in that kind of quiet. That's a great question.
What
really
more? If you don't mind.
I'm here for it.
When did you know, like, what was the seed or the moment of this, the beginning of this novel? That one nugget of information or place or?
Wow. I mean, it's, like I said, it's so hard because what I thought it was about and what it ended up being about, as almost always, weren't exactly the same. But I think if I go way back to the first seed in kind of a fertile soil, it was when I was doing my research for Mrs. Lewis, and I saw all these little nuggets, and there were so many things, so many things, I just combined those words, that I couldn't use after I wrote Mrs. Lewis. And Amanda and I talked about it a lot, like, what do I do with all this amazing information? And so the first thing we did was do that podcast, like that 7-series podcast about behind the scenes of Mrs. Lewis. But I still had all these little breadcrumbs and seeds, and I couldn't figure out what to do with them, because there are loads of books about Narnia, like, he meant this, he meant that. One man thinks it's the 7 books or the 7 planets. Somebody else thinks it's, but Lewis never said any of those things. And and maybe those people are right. It doesn't matter to me whether they're right or not, but I didn't want to extrapolate. I wanted to take all those breadcrumbs and try to make a story out of them. And then, I don't know what came next. George came next.
What about the Pied Piper? I remember you telling me about it. Oh.
Yeah, that's another. But it is so, because it's so fascinating that they would name that Pied Piper. Who does that? Who does that? All right. Yes, ma'am.
I know that you focused on the language and the wardrobe, but as you were researching, did you see other things and thought, oh yeah, that's in Caspian or those kinds of things? I know you didn't go beyond the first book.
Yeah, no, I can, yes, there are. I could definitely see some of them, but I was very myopic. Like I stuck to 7 events in his life that you don't get told, you see them through this little boy's eyes. When Lewis gets on a train to go to boarding school, George gets on the train to go to boarding school. It's very immersive. And I knew I couldn't do 25 things from his life, 30 things from his life. And I didn't want to tell you anything. I wanted to show you. And so I only picked 7 things. And some of those, of course, show up. For example, Lewis fought in World War I. He was injured in World War I. His dearest friend was killed in World War I. And he had forever was impacted by that. He didn't talk about it that much, but it changed him forever, the horrors of World War I. His brother fought in World War I and in World War II, warning. But Lewis was injured, and there are these grand battle scenes, and they're in a lot of the novels. I forget which one of the 7, but I think it's The Horse and His Boy, that are that are dedicated to Douglas and Davy, who are Joy's sons. One of my favorite first lines in The Horse and His Boy is, I think it's The Horse and His Boy, it was the silver chair. Like I said, I'm by no means a Chronicles expert, but where he says his name was Eustace Scrub, and he almost deserved it. And that I think he did that because of this schoolmaster he had, who had this terrible name and was a really cruel person. So yes, I can see other parts of his life sprinkled in some of the others. Most notably, the prequel he wrote, which was later. People sometimes argue about which order to read the Narnia Chronicles, because he wrote what he calls the prequel later. In fact, he wrote it 4th or 5th. But he wrote 7 of those in 7 years after waiting 10 years to write them. And that one has a lot of his life in it. And what's fascinating, if you look back, and this is one of the things that struck me when I was writing this, is that I'd never heard anyone mention before. I'm sure someone did. I'm just saying I never heard it. Is that he was simultaneously working on his autobiography, which is called Surprised by Joy, while he was working on the Chronicles of Narnia. So how could pieces of his life not show up here? He was also working and having memories of being a boy and being a child, all those kind of things. So,
I have one other question too. Your fairy article, is it available to be read somewhere?
absolutely, on Wednesday.
Okay.
On Wednesday. It's with In Parade magazine. So if you go to my Facebook or my website or anywhere on Wednesday morning, it will post. I should have brought the whole thing to read. I was like, I'm not going to read a whole article. I know, that's what I'll do from now on. Starting on Wednesday, I'll give a handout and then just say, do you have any questions? Read your work, read your homework. And I won't have to talk. Hi, Margaret.
Hi. So you talked a lot about personality and how your a lot of images came to you in that state between dreaming and thinking. And then you talked about how George is in a state between like, I guess what you mean is like in between almost, and I guess childhood is so state. But what do you think is the significance of that phenomenon? Like, is that like when logic is suspended or like?
Oh, what a great question. Can you tell she's a writer? So there's so many definitions of what a liminal space is, but for me, it's that space when your logic is, you're conscious and your logic is still there, but it's quiet enough, calm down enough, maybe it's taking a nice nap, so that your imagination and intuition and all of those other things that kind of when your ego is a little bit shut down too, so your defenses aren't up. And things can bubble to the surface that allows you to see things differently than you're already seeing them. That allows you to say, to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. That allows you to notice, I don't care whether it's the sunlight falling on a leaf in a different way, but something that gives you that hint that there's something more. And when I talk about George being there, I am talking a little bit about between sickness and health, but I'm also talking about that naivety of an 8-year-old who might still believe, or a 7-year-old who might still believe the wardrobe back might pop out. You know, when I was a child and first read these, we used to spend our summers in a place called Cape Cod, and you guys know it's one of my favorite places in the world. But I would wander the cranberry bogs and I would 100% believe that I would pop out into another world. And that there was a one I couldn't see and I was gonna find it. I didn't until I started writing books, but that's a different story. Anybody else have a question? Yeah, Michael.
So you wrote a book about joy, now you wrote a book about C.S. Lewis. Is this a franchise? Are you assembling the Avengers?
Absolutely, I'm done. I wash my hands of the Lewis family. No, he's a very complicated man. Not that Lewis isn't. Well, what's fascinating, and that's a great question, and Sweet Kaylee asked me the same thing, but I think that I can never say what I will or won't write about, because when I finished becoming Mrs. Lewis, everybody would say, are you going to write a sequel or a prequel or something else? And I said, no way. Like I said what I wanted to say in that book and in that podcast and in the probably 25 articles I wrote about it. Like I said what I wanted to say, and I'm still saying what I wanted to say with that book, because I think that book is really important for us, not because I wrote it, but because it introduces us to a woman who completely altered the life of one of the most famous authors of the 20th century and was given so little credit, and yet completely changed the last decade of his work. But that's a soapbox. So I think, when I wrote this, it wasn't, so I never meant to write about Lewis per se. What I meant to write about was her and her transformational journey. And then here, what I was trying to say had something so much bigger to do with how our lives might show up in stories, but that there's so much about story that's ineffable, that's unexplainable, and that can't be pinned down with appendix or logic or rationalization. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the best vehicle for that, because everyone knows what it is, even if they've never read it. So and I had seen all those breadcrumbs in his life, but a dear friend of mine, involved in this Lewis community, has this fantastic story about Warnie. And she's like, I want you to, I'm like, no, I'm done. Like, stop, So I don't have any franchise plans at all. I think, and in between I wrote a book about Savannah in the 1800s. So for me, it's a lot about what makes me curious, right? Because if I'm curious about it, that means someone else is curious about it. If I'm curious about it, that means there's a story in there. So for me to say I'm only going to write about this would never work for me. I think that's why I've never written a series. I think, although I wish I could, because to start over again, to write in 1950 England and 1800 Savannah are not the same thing. So I make my life a little harder than it has to be. All right. Any last questions before I let you guys Yeah.
What do you see coming next?
Oh, what a year this has been. I mean, do you believe we've gotten the past 19 months that we all have had? And in the past year, I've had 4 works out. I had an Audible original called Wild Swan about Florence Nightingale. I had a short story in a collection called Reunion Beach. And then I had Surviving Savannah and this. So right now, I'm just talking. Like I can, like, every time I sit down to write, I'm like, I can do this. I know how to do this. No, I don't. So I will, and I'm working on it, but the well has been rung a little dry. Oh, and I have a new baby. I don't know if you all follow me on social media, you have to know because I kept talking about it, but our daughter lives in Hawaii, which is very far away. 18 hours, 20 minutes to be exact by plane. And she has a little girl named Bridget, and she just had a baby named Beatrix, and Beatrix was born on Bridget's birthday, October 6th. So we went over there and came back yesterday. So
Patty gave me a little bit. Texted me.
So that I'm up here making sense to sort of. Yeah, I'm in the women's space. You are right, my friend. All right, any last questions before we shut it down and you guys can eat your Turkish delight? And Jake is here to sell books. And Amanda, thank you for coming. And he has gift wrap ones. So we are making your Christmas so easy. It's already gift wrapped. And I have little gift tags that you can just throw on it and you are done. I'm here if you want to ask me anything else. Thank you for coming. It means a lot to me. Thank you. So fun talking about it for the first time. You did it. Oh, you're the only one I care about. Thank you. It's not even out. She might be a little biased. I know. It's like. Wow, that was crazy. Let me grab my. Thank you. Q&A.